Hello, everyone. So in our last video, we performed lab number 1 and lab number 2 in the AWS labs for Fortinet Security for Public Cloud. We deployed a VPC, we deployed a FortiGate, and we plugged that FortiGate into a public subnet and a private subnet, and we deployed a Windows server in that private subnet. We have an inbound policy allowing RDP access to the Windows server, and we have an outbound policy allowing internet access for the Windows server to get out through the FortiGate. We're going to start lab number 3 in the AWS labs. And in lab number 3, we're going to deploy a FortiWeb. The FortiWeb, sitting right here, a little brown mark underneath it, is going to plug into the private subnet. So we've got this private subnet where the Windows server is plugged in and where the FortiGate is plugged in, and we're going to allow inbound access from the internet through the FortiGate to the FortiWeb. FortiWeb is going to evaluate web traffic against policy, and provided that that web traffic is accepted by policy, it's going to send that web traffic to Windows Server, where we're going to install Microsoft Internet Information Server, or IIS. Basically, it's the Windows web server. If you're not familiar with IIS, it's just the basic Windows web server. We're not going to create any kind of fancy page. We're just going to use the basic IIS installation page, something that we can use to test a little bit of web traffic. We're going to just continue to use the environment that we set up in labs number 1 and number 2. Let's go ahead and get started. Change myself back to a mouse pointer. Very good. We'll pull this over here. This is my Windows system. You guys saw this in the last video. And we'll just bring it up real quick and make sure it can still get out to the internet, make sure things still seem to be working. I'm RDP'd into it right now, so I know the inbound policy is working for RDP. If the outbound policy is working, I should be able to do things like this. Let's go to Google. Yep, Google's working outbound, and I should be able to say things like, what is my IP address? And yep, that's the public IP. If those of you watched the earlier video, that's the elastic IP address that I was using just a little bit earlier. All right, very good. That seems to be working okay. Let's minimize this down. And up, there's my console for AWS. Let's go ahead and work on deploying that FortiWeb. So I'm going to go into launch instance. I'll tell it to search for Fortinet, and then I'll say AWS Marketplace. This will come up with several options. I want the FortiWeb. Fortinet, FortiWeb, Web Application Firewall, WAF VM. This one right here, that's a pay-as-you-go or an on-demand version, which is what I'll use in the lab. So let's go ahead and click Select. Now this lab is written on a version of the course previous to 6.3.4. So just to follow the course lab, we're going to go ahead and deploy an earlier version of FortiWeb. So instead of deploying and clicking continue, which would have pushed out 6.3.4, we'll say view additional details in the AWS Marketplace. Once we get there, we'll say continue to subscribe. And I have already agreed to the terms and conditions. If I had not, this little bar down here that says there was an effective date wouldn't be here, and I'd see like an accept button, something along those lines. But it is there, and I can click continue configuration, which also would not be available. It would be grayed out if I had not already accepted the terms and conditions. And if this is the first time that you're deploying FortiWeb, much like the FortiGate, you will need to go through that step. And it takes a couple of minutes after you click accept for it to finally come up and say that you've accepted it and click continue to configuration. Very good. Now we can choose version and we can choose region. Now, if you'll recall from our earlier labs, everything we've been deploying was in US East 2 or Ohio. So let's say software version, And we'll go ahead and use 6.1.1. We'll say region, US East Ohio, which is otherwise known as US East 2. We should be able to click continue and answer a few other questions. Notably, size. We need something a bit smaller than that, save ourselves a little bit of money. I think the C4 large should be large enough for our purposes. They'll ask, which VPC do you want to deploy into? That is the only VPC I have in Ohio. If you can't find your VPC, there's a very high likelihood that on the previous screen you forgot to set yourself to the correct region. A VPC is a region-wide resource, so as long as you are choosing the correct region, you should see it there. Now within that VPC, we're going to deploy into the private subnet. There are two subnets. One's the 10.0.0/24. I had trouble getting those words out. And the other one is the 10.01/0/24. And that's our private subnet, so that's what we're going to deploy into. It is noteworthy that you do not get to see the subnet names. You only get to see the subnet resource identifiers. If I had any doubt, I could always go over to the console screen, find the name for private subnet, match it up to the resource identifier, but I happen to remember what the CIDR was, so that's easy enough for me to separate. Next, we're just going to take the security group settings based on seller settings. So what this is a security group that Fortinet has put in the marketplace, and it's basically the default for the FortiWeb. So let's call it FortiWeb security group. And I'll put the same thing in the description. See what we have here: port 22, port 80, port 443, port 8333, and then some high-level UDP ports in there. Great. It will ask us which key pair we want to use, and as you recall from the earlier video, I created lab key pair just for today. Before I can do that though, I do need to click save up here. Now my launch button is present. Before I click launch, I'm just going to look through this one more time. 6.11, US East Ohio, C4 large, it's 3.75 gigs of RAM on that, the only VPC that I have there, and the subnet with the 10.0.10/24 network. All right, very good. Let's go ahead and launch. Congratulations, it's launching. Let's go ahead and go to the EC2 console. It'll be launched, but it'll still be initializing under status. Here it is, initializing. Let's give it a name. FortiWeb Lab3. We'll move this over so we can see it a little bit better. We've got the FortiWeb security group. So if you look at the bottom half of the screen, I've got FortiWeb selected on top. We can see the security group over here. Let's go look at that security group. I'm going to add one more inbound rule to it, something that we'll use here shortly. Let's add a rule. Let's say custom TCP rule. There won't be a built-in rule for this. We'll say port 8443 from anywhere. This will be used for management traffic. So ideally, I could come in here and say specifically which public IP addresses I wanted to be able to access this, but for lab purposes, any public IP is fine. This will all be deleted before the end of the day anyway. All right, let's go. Now, let's go back to the lab diagram for just a second. There's going to be two public IP addresses that we use, or I'm sorry, I said public, I apologize. There's going to be two private IP addresses that we use on the FortiWeb. One of the private IP addresses will only be for management traffic. So on this one port, on this one elastic network interface, and I'm just going to kind of draw a little brown dot there to represent that ENI, I'm going to have two IP addresses in the private subnet. One of them will be used for a VIP for web traffic, and the other one will be used to be able to reach management traffic. And in fact, as I think about the management traffic, I am not going to manage this FortiWeb from the internet. think what I'm going to do instead, let's just erase my ink here, and let's say drawing tools. For management traffic, I will manage it from the Windows server. So that way I don't have to create a VIP on the FortiGate to allow management traffic inbound. The only traffic that I'm going to allow inbound through the FortiGate is HTTP traffic. So I will have a VIP here for port 80 that forwards to one of the IP addresses on the FortiWeb, and then I will have another IP address on the FortiWeb that I'm not going to open up a VIP for, that I'm not going to open up an inbound policy for, that will only be accessible from the web server within the VPC. That way nobody's going to bring up my management console. Let's erase all of that, go back to my normal mouse pointer, there we go, bring this back up, very good, and let me just raise this to the top. Custom TCP rule, there's the one, I just created it, 8443, yeah. I could even have been more specific and I could say that this was only gonna be sourced from within the VPC. The way I've got it right now is fine for my purposes. Yeah, let's see, oops, don't need this. This is just gonna be in the way. So if I want 2 IP addresses on that FortiWeb, I need the elastic network interface in the AWS console to have 2 IP addresses. I could, of course, go into the FortiWeb and configure whatever I wanted, but the AWS cloud isn't going to send traffic to this FortiWeb unless it knows the IP is running within that operating system, unless it's been configured to know the IP is on that elastic network interface. So let's go down to network interfaces. Actually, before we do that, let's just look at our list of instances. I think this will make a little more sense if we start there. I've got my FortiWeb. The instance is B3F1, B3F1. And if I look at this instance, there's a private IP, 10.01.168, and there's one elastic network interface. I'll click on ETH0, and there's the elastic network interface right there. It's 85 alpha alpha, 10.01.68. So let's go down to network interfaces, and we see there are many network interfaces in here. This one right here is the Windows network interface. And there's only really one reason that I know that that's the Windows network interface. First of all, I don't have a lot of choices. This is a lab environment. I don't have a lot of things running here, so it's pretty easy for me to keep track. If I had any doubts, I could look over at the security group and go, oh, this is the Windows security group. That's probably the Windows network interface. And it is, it's the Windows network interface. Let's just label it, make things a little bit easier. Network interface. And by process of elimination, that makes this the FortiWeb network interface. Very good. Now we've got these 2 network interfaces. I wanted to add a second IP address to the FortiWeb. So I'm going to go to Manage. I'm going to right-click the network interface for the FortiWeb. I'm going to say Manage IP addresses. And as we can see, there's the one IP address that's on it right now, 10.01.168. We see that there's this Manage IP address pop-up that we've got in here, kind of tell us what's going on. We can add a new IP, and it could be auto-assigned. Or we could hand type it in. I've shown an example of that, I think, with the FortiGate, where I chose to hand type it in. 10.01.168 was one of the auto-assigned. So just for fun, let's type it in. And for those of you who paid attention in the earlier video, you might see what I'm about to do wrong here. I'm going to say 10.0.1.100. And I'm going to say, yes, update. Yeah. And for those of you who are paying attention, it says basically what this is trying to tell me is 10.0.1.100 is assigned somewhere already, and you can't move it here. So let's go ahead and hit cancel. I guess I could move it here, but I'd have to click some other things first. Let's go manage IP addresses. So it's not going to let you easily assign an IP that's already in use somewhere else. Let's say assign a new IP, and for fun, we will say 10.0.1.101. something that's not used somewhere else. Yes, update. There it is. 10.01.101 is the secondary IP address there. Should be able to close that now. And even on this screen, I can see secondary private IP 10.01.101 right in here, as opposed to the primary IPv4 IP 10.01.168. So there's two IPs on there. Could also go and see under instances. We could go to the FortiWeb. And over here under FortiWeb, yep, we can see it right there. Private IP address and secondary private IP address. We also probably would see it underneath the ETH0. Actually, you know what? I only see the primary when I click on ETH0. So I guess you cannot see both IPs there. Just up here, every time I put my mouse over something, it tries to highlight it. Just right up there, private IPs and secondary private IPs. Very good. So we're going to allow web traffic to flow through the FortiGate to the FortiWeb. That means the FortiWeb's security group needs to allow port 80 inbound. And if I look over here on the right side next to security groups and I look at inbound rules, there is an inbound rule for port 80. So that's already done for me. I don't need to worry about that. Let's go ahead and take the Windows system and install our web server on there. There's lots of different ways we could do this. We'll use PowerShell just so that I don't have to. The GUI's a little bit slow on this Windows system. I picked a very small instance type for a Windows server. This way I don't have to go clicking around the GUI. Install - Windows feature name web - server. Include management tools. There we go. Hit enter. This is going to take a minute, I am sure. While we're waiting for it, I'm going to queue up the web browser with what I want next. I'm going to point it at 127.0.1. Now at the moment, when I go to 127.0.1, it doesn't work. It tries to bing it because there's nothing there. But when I'm done, or I could do localhost, when I am done and the web server is installed, I should be able to bring up a basic web page. So we'll just leave that there at localhost, wait for our install to finish. The other thing that I will get ready while we're here is a connection to the FortiWeb. When we hit the FortiWeb, we're going to hit it on its primary IP address, hps://10.0.1. And I believe if my memory is correct, 168 on port 8443. Yeah, it looks like the FortiWeb. Normal certificate errors for a self-signed certificate. And I should be able to log on to this with admin, and I will need the instance ID. So my install is nearly done, but since it's not quite done, I'm going to go get the instance ID for the FortiWeb. And those of you recall, instance ID is located any number of places. It's up here, right? It's down here, right there. I highlight it, and I'm going to go ahead and get it from there because I got this nice little copy to clipboard option. And we'll go back to Windows, and we'll just put that right there. Log in. I will change the password to something else. All right, very good. I'm logged into the FortiWeb. Now, while we've been doing a little bit of work, waiting for this install to finish, it looks like the install completed. I think I should be able to, well, first of all, let's not do HTTPS here. I'm not actually setting up a HTTPS page, just a normal HTTP clear text, simple web page. There it is, localhost, Internet Information Services. That's your basic IIS splash page you can use to test that your IIS install worked, and it did. Very good. Now we're going to do some configuration on the FortiWeb. So let's make this full screen, be a little bit easier to get through. We'll start with server objects. We're going to need network. There it is. There we are. Very good. Server objects, server pool. Create a web server pool very quickly here. And again, this class is not really about the FortiWeb itself. There's a standalone FortiWeb class. So I'm just going to be making some very basic configuration to allow access to a web server. Let's start off with calling this web server pool. Reverse proxy is fine. Single server. Very good. I'll go ahead and click OK here so that I can click Create New at the bottom. Choose Create New. Status is enabled. Server type IP. We will use the Windows server's IP address within the VPC. And quite frankly, I don't remember exactly what it is. 10.0.1. I know it's a 10.01 because it's a private network. Very fortunately, I can just do show desktop, and AWS puts this right up in the top right-hand corner, way up here. It is 10.0.1.89. So let's go back here and say, please send traffic to 10.0.1.89 on port 80. No connection limit, and we don't really need anything else turned on for our purposes today. All right, we've got that. Let's create our virtual server. Create new. Now, I could go in here and say use interface IP. Now, this is the interface on the FortiWeb. Remember, you got port number 1 over here. The trick is port number 1 is running the primary IP, which is 10.01.168. I don't want to have my firewall policy talk to that IP address. I want my firewall policy to talk to a different IP that's only going to be used for this web service. So if you recall, I set it to 10.01.101, 10.01.101/32, and interface is on port number 1. Very good. Now we need policy. Policy, and oh, that was kind of strange. A little bit of trouble in my GUI there. It wasn't showing everything right away. It was probably my slow RDP connection that was causing that more than anything. All right, let's go ahead and create policy to allow access to the web server. Web, whoop, there we go, service, policy, single server, this virtual server connected to this server pool. Client real IP, we'll leave that flipped off. HTTP service is just going to be HTTP. It's going to be HTTP all the way through. We do not need to redirect HTTP to HTTPS. And for our purposes, the inline medium level security will be fine for what we're going to do. Okay, let's go ahead and click OK. Got our policy. Let's turn up some logging. We'll turn on the traffic log so that we can confirm traffic flowing through the FortiWeb. We know everything worked okay when we're done. So we'll go down to log and report. We'll go to log configuration, log config. We will go to other log settings, and we'll enable the traffic log. Then we'll go all the way to the bottom and click apply. Wonderful. Now, if I was inclined to, I think I should be able to do this. HTTP:// 10.0.1.101. There we go. So I'm hitting the FortiWeb's secondary IP address. Within the VPC, this is working. Within the subnet, this is working. Now I need to make it work from the internet. So in order for this to work from the internet, I need firewall policy with a VIP on the FortiGate, and it's going to send traffic on port 80 to 10.0.1.101. So let's go ahead and minimize down this RDP session. we have over there? There we go. Sorry, I have a little header on the top of my screen share that means I can't see the middle tabs. It probably doesn't show up on the recording because it's part of the recording software. All right, let's log in here. Later, please. So first we're going to need that VIP, policies and objects, VIPs. As you can recall, we had a VIP already, but that VIP was only for port 3389. So we will create another VIP. We will call this one Windows Lab 3. Because this is AWS Lab 3 within the constructs of the course. Which interface? This is for traffic coming in on the public side, port number 1, which is 10.0.0.226. So we're going to tell it if something comes on 10.0.0.226, send it to 10.0.1.101, but let's filter it. Now earlier I did port forwarding to filter it, and that's really useful if it's running on a different port externally than internally. But here, let's just use the service filter just to prove that both ways work for making sure a VIP only works for a particular port. Good. A duplicate entry already exists. Don't think it likes how I've done this. I think I'd have to do the other one with the same service filtering. I can probably do this, port 80 to port 80. Yep. If I wanted to use those service filters, I would have needed to change the first one to a service filter as well instead of a port forwarding. There we go. Two different VIPs. Let's go set IPv4 policy here. And we'll create a new policy. Windows Web, well, let's just actually say Web to FortiWeb, because that's what's really happening. Port 80 is coming inbound and it's getting sent to the FortiWeb. So something comes in on the public side, going out to the private side where the source is anything, and the destination is Windows Lab 3. In fact, in hindsight, I probably didn't even need to call that Windows Lab 3. I probably should have called it FortiWeb Lab 3. But since it's already there, I'm going to continue to stick with it. HTTP, there we go. All right, flow-based, source NAT it. This does not need to be source natted as it hits the FortiWeb. Log allowed traffic, all sessions. And I'm going to turn this on so that we can, if it doesn't work for some reason and we need to track back through the logs, that can be a little bit helpful. All right. So a little bit earlier, we hit this inside of the Windows system, which is inside of the VPC on 10.0.1.101. Now I would like to hit this using the elastic IP address, 18.219.85. 18.219. Just like that, I already forgot it. Actually, I think it was prompting me for it. Well, we'll get it over here. 18.219.9.85. There we go. IIS. Very good. Let's just kind of walk through the connection and see where the traffic went. We go to FortiGate, log and report. In fact, let's do it a different way. Let's say web to FortiWeb and just say show matching logs. That way it's already filtered for us when we get here. Yep, there it is. Source, the destination was 10.0.0.226. It was accepted by that policy, which means it should have been passed along to the FortiWeb. And once we go there, well, oop, there we go, log in. Typed in the password, forgot to click login. Should be able to go down to log and report. Let's make this full screen. Log access, traffic, and we see traffic. Now, I happen to know that this 166 address, this was me. And I only know that because that's the ISP that I use. That's typical for me. Now what's interesting is there's other traffic hitting my web server right now. Looks like some traffic from Brazil. However, that's probably just somebody scanning the internet, looking at traffic, which is not altogether uncommon in the internet. Okay, that's it. That's what that last piece of lab number 3 looks like. Let's go back and take a look at the lab topology diagram, just kind of remind ourselves what we did for lab number 3. Let's bring this diagram over here and set up a pen for ourselves. Here it is. So we just deployed this FortiWeb right here. It's got a single interface. On that single interface, it has 2 IP addresses. The Elastic Network interface is a primary IP and a secondary IP. On the primary IP address, we are managing the system. And so the only access we have to manage it on that IP address right now happens to come from within the VPC. In fact, within this subnet, there's no policy with VIP allowing access to port 8443 on that FortiGate. So all of the management happens to be internal right now. Let's erase all those drawings there. And there is a secondary IP address that we assigned to that ENI when we were configuring it. That secondary IP address is used for a virtual server. There we go, pen. And that virtual server is exposed through a VIP on the FortiGate. Right? That VIP's allowing inbound access to the virtual server IP. The virtual server IP is processing against policy and then sending to the web server right there. And that's what's allowing outbound access. Well, that's labs 1, 2, and 3 for AWS. In separate videos, we're going to cover labs 4, 5, and 6. So I hope you join me for those videos. Since I'm done using these resources, we won't use resources from labs 1, 2, and 3. We won't use the virtual machines, the EC2 instances. Let's go ahead and terminate those because some of you may be following along on your own, and I want to make sure you know how to easily terminate all those resources. So I'm going to say erase all drawings, put myself back on a mouse pointer. Let's go back to the AWS console. There's a lot of different ways of doing this. For now, I'm going to go to the EC2 console. I'm going to go to the list of EC2 instances. Highlight them, and I'm going to say instance state terminate. Now down at the bottom here, I want you to see this part right here, release attached elastic IPs. You want to expand this and you want to check release elastic IPs. What sometimes happens is you deploy an elastic IP address, you associate it with a VM, then maybe you delete the VM, virtual machine, EC2 instance means the same thing. So when I say VM, for the sake of AWS, we mean EC2 instance. But you delete the EC2 instance and you forget to remove the elastic IP and you continue to get charged for it. In fact, you get charged more for it than if it was just sitting there not processing any traffic on a VM. So you definitely want to release that. Let's go ahead and say yes and terminate. There we go. Having a little trouble with my mouse clicker. Let's give that a moment. Make sure things get removed. You'll notice my elastic IP address no longer shows up under elastic IPs. That's good. That's what we wanted. We wanted to make sure that that disappeared. If for some reason it didn't disappear, I would have chose it and clicked it and highlighted it and chose to release it. And then if there was any kind of errors for that, I would have addressed whatever was causing the errors. So I want to make sure that that's out of there. I go to instances. One of them is terminated. The other two are still shutting down. And I'm going to wait a moment for that to happen because there's some follow-up steps here that I want to make sure you catch if you're shutting down your own resources. I'll just refresh. Okay, 2 of the 3 are terminated. Almost there. Refresh again. If I wasn't waiting for it, it would only take 5 seconds, but I'm waiting for it, so it takes every bit of the time it takes. Let's refresh one more time there. Well, there is something we can do while we're waiting. Remember we created that API credential for the Fabric connector. While this is still terminating, we can go get rid of that. So we can go to Services, go to IAM, Identity and Access Management. There's going to be a user out there that we created earlier. Users, there's 2 users. One of them I don't want to get rid of. There we go, Lab3, delete user. That's the one I want to get rid of. The other one I'm going to use for something else. Yes, delete. Now in your console, I suspect that if you created this account only for learning, only for doing these labs, you probably don't have any other users that should remain out there. But for my lab, for my scenario, I'm going to leave that second one, home firewall, out there. Let's go back to EC2 instances and see if our instances have been terminated. Hey, everything's been terminated. Great. Let's go look at Elastic Network Interfaces. So there's Network and Security, Network Interfaces. I have this ENI that's still hanging out here. This is the FortiGate's secondary ENI. It was not created as part of the marketplace deployment. I created it after the fact and I attached it to the FortiGate. Because I did it after the fact, when I deleted the FortiGate, it did not delete it. It's still there. So I need to go ahead and delete this. I don't need it for anything else. Yes, delete. And it's gone. If you are not going to do labs 4, 5, and 6 with me, then you may also want to go out and delete your VPC. I'm not going to delete them because I'm going to use them for lab 4, 5, and 6. And very shortly today, I'm going to make those recordings. But if you want to delete them, go to your VPCs, choose the VPC in question, choose Action and Delete. And when it asks you to confirm, say, yes, I would like to delete the VPC. Take a note here. It's going to delete several things for you. Subnets, security groups, internet gateways, routing tables. Where are you at there? There we go, routing tables. Really, it even should have deleted that network interface for me. I just wanted to be really explicit about deleting it because I don't know if you're going to go through and delete this VPC now, or if you're going to try labs 4, 5, and 6. So I say that labs 4 and 5 uses VPC, lab 6 uses something else. So if you are going to continue on lab 4 and 5, no need to delete this now. If you start lab 4 and 5 later, you're going to need to recreate this VPC. You can always go back and play the instructions. It was at the very beginning of the first video with lab 1. I'm going to hit cancel because I'm going to use this in about another hour or so. All right, well, this is the end of the lab 3 video, and I will come back in another video and talk you guys through lab 4. Talk to you later, everybody. Bye-bye.